What I seek to do is to highlight and pose a challenge to the center ACEPS in the light of what I call African indigenous knowledge systems. So I try to situate the place of these African indigenous knowledge systems within the center itself, the African Center for Epistemology and Philosophy of Science. So as it seeks to foster knowledge production and dissemination within the area of epistemology and philosophy of science itself, I believe that the center could take seriously it as one of its core areas. It should rethink African values, traditions, and belief systems that have been traditionally suppressed and excluded, as well as being neglected. So this could also be taken as also one of the challenges in the center itself. So I first seek to understand indigenous knowledge systems themselves, or what African indigenous knowledge systems themselves are. And one issue that is important in the light of these IKS is to realize that we ought not to take knowledge as a menu that should be prepared from the outside, then it could be served within the African context. So if we could take IKSs that way, that could be the first starting point. Then I also seek to highlight the rich epistemic and scientific heritage that we can find, for example, from the Mapungubwe, the Great Zimbabwe communities, the Timbuktu in Mali, and try to find out how best we can tap indigenous knowledge from these African traditional communities and move forward. Then I also look at the question like if I look at my great-grandfather, for example, is one man who didn't have formal education, any knowledge of mathematics, and a lot of cattle, more than 100 or more than 300 or so. But I'm told that if you one day could come back home with one of them missing, you would know that there's something wrong. There's some beast that is missing from the flock. So what can we say about the kind of knowledge that we can tap from our traditional, from our elders? How did you get this kind of mathematical knowledge in terms of knowing the number of beasts that he has in his flock? So that's also something to think about. Then if we also look at various other indigenous methods of prediction, for example, of rainfall, prediction of the coming in of the new seasons amongst the traditional African communities, certain methods of curing diseases, healthcare practices, among other systems. So we ought to maybe revisit some of these issues and see where we have lost it. So the National Research Foundation in 2000 defined IKS as a complex set of knowledge and technologies existing and developed around specific conditions of populations and communities indigenous to a specific geographic area. So that's the working definition with which I work with as I look at IKSs. So I look at them as unique and particular to cultural contexts. So there are also homegrown approaches to knowledge and science, and we must seriously harness these indigenous approaches to knowledge in order to understand, appreciate, and solve the current challenges that we face as Africans in the environment in which we exist in. So the other issue also is that there's a sense in which we look at knowledge claims as being universal. I don't have problems with that. Knowledge ought to be understood from a certain universalist standpoint. But at the same time, we must also appreciate the need to also consider the approaches to these universal frontiers of knowledge, such that we might not have problems in us having Chinese epistemology and science, American epistemology and science, so as well as African epistemology and science. So indigenous knowledge systems must be approached in such a way that we also respect the need for diversity and difference in terms of cultural context and in terms of how we can also approach knowledge that way. Then there's also a background that also needs to be looked at in terms of IKSs. So it's a sad background that indigenous knowledge systems are coming from, considering the history of colonialism in Africa. So IKSs have not been spared. They have generally been predicated. The discourse on IKS is predicated by a debate between, for example, Eurocentric and Afrocentric thinking on knowledge and what I would term the ego cogito view in the Eurocentric conception of knowledge, where there is a tendency to look at knowledge, the knowledge as being universal to such an extent that African indigenous knowledge has tended to be suppressed. So this has just been a result of what is I would call the universalist fallacy in Eurocentric thinking. So it has also resulted in the suppression of IKSs based on that fallacious thinking. I have taken one example from a recent work by one German philosopher who is writing on animals and on a book on animals and African ethics. And he writes, he says, and I quote, "While I agree that there are beliefs and that these may be skills that are unique and indigenous to Africa, I doubt whether the same can be said about propositional knowledge or knowledge that." So this thinker seems to lack philosophical respect for African IKSs, and reminiscent in him is this Eurocentric thinking that Africa cannot contribute anything to the universalist knowledge frontier. So I would challenge the center to also look at some of those perspectives, especially with regard to the quest for epistemic knowledge in the African context. IKSs also face a problem in terms of documentation, and for various reasons, no serious attempts have been made to document African indigenous knowledge systems. And the center itself could take advantage of that and also consider its potential in terms of being the center for the documentation, publication, and repository of these indigenous knowledge systems in Africa. Then lastly, I would want to look at the necessity of the center itself, the African Center for Epistemology and Philosophy of Science. And before I do that, I want to look at some of the technical issues that they may need to look at. In the nomenclature itself, the indigenous knowledge systems, we might also have problems in terms of the political overtones implicit in that, because it could be interpreted differently by different people. For example, the first interpretation one could get from the use of the word indigenous is that it could be understood in a way that belittles and suppresses indigenous knowledge systems themselves just because they are indigenous. Then the other interpretation one could get is that it could be understood as implying that indigenous knowledge systems are second order to non-indigenous knowledge systems. The other third interpretation one also could get from the indigenous knowledge systems is that it could be understood as being exclusive of other non-indigenous knowledge systems. So in other words, what are we saying if we say African indigenous knowledge systems vis-a-vis other African indigenous knowledge systems? So we need to think seriously about those issues. So I'll now move on to look at maybe the African indigenous knowledge systems themselves. We must, of course, understand them as knowledge systems like I have already said, that I identified with our social, cultural, traditional, and political context, as well as how we can use them to address our social and political problems that we are facing. Masolo writes, and he says that there appears to be little disagreement that there is knowledge that is indigenous to Africa, that is knowledge that is unique, traditional, local, and knowledge that exists within and develops around the specific conditions of the experiences of African people. The other idea is also to look at IKSs in the light of this understanding of indigenous knowledge systems, where we are saying they ought to address our problems within a specific context. There is also an attempt to look at indigenous knowledge as being anachronistic. In other words, as being unable to solve the current problems that we face presently. So we must also try to address that problem and look at indigenous knowledge as knowledge that ought to speak to African challenges and concerns. The one writer, or two writers, Owusu, Answer, and Mncube, argue that knowledge or science and its methods of investigation cannot be divorced from a people's history, cultural context, and worldview. So the challenge with which ACEPS has is that as a quest for the Africanization of the African university, the current attempts in most African universities to Africanize, we also need to place this discourse of indigenous knowledge systems within the quest for the Africanization of the African universities. Then indigenous knowledge systems could then become relevant within the center itself. Then IKSs have also not found space and platform on which they could occupy, and ACEPS could also take advantage of that. And like I have said, to publish extensively on them, to transmit and popularize these. I have also noted that in 2004, the South African cabinet adopted policy on indigenous knowledge systems, or African indigenous knowledge systems here in South Africa. So we might also need to seriously think what has been their fate between 2004 and presently. Then in conclusion, I would like to look at ACEPS as an Afrocentric project that is trying to revive African indigenous knowledge, or African indigenous knowledge systems. I also want to look at the center itself as pursuing the dream of African Renaissance, trying to rethink our Africanity, our Africanness, and situate them within our context so that we see the extent to which we can solve our own problems as Africans. Then I have maybe two questions that I would leave and pause. Perhaps we can address those in the question as we move on. The first one is, should the study of epistemology and science be studied in isolation with other non-indigenous knowledge systems in this case? Because if we appeal to indigenous knowledge systems, African indigenous knowledge systems, what are we saying about other non-indigenous knowledge systems? So I would also challenge the center itself to also open conversations with other non-African indigenous knowledge systems so that we can tap in from each other. Then the other question is, what ought to be the relationship subsisting between the indigenous and non-indigenous? Can we kind of blend those, or we can rely on the indigenous alone, or the non-indigenous with the indigenous, they don't mix? What are we saying? Then the other one is, how can indigenous knowledge systems and non-IKSs benefit from each other? It's almost the same question. How can we blend these indigenous knowledge systems and non-indigenous knowledge systems so that we proceed forward? Then lastly, How would ACEPS consider practical ways by which indigenous knowledge systems could be harnessed in order to address real-world challenges that we are currently facing, for example, in the area of medicine, health care, especially issues to do with HIV and AIDS? Thank you.